Now. So now we are with the keynote lecture of the 17th GARS Junior Research Workshop. Our keynote lecturer is Alexandre Jacquillat. He is from MIT. Actually, he has a PhD from MIT. Then he went to Carnegie Mellon, and then now he's back at MIT. And he won many prizes, research awards. His area of research is operations management, transport. I would say most of the time, most of the research that he's been doing, at least to my knowledge, is related to air transport. So it fits perfectly the area that the German Aviation Research Society is interested in. And for the students, I just wanted to share with you that maybe this is a good career opportunity for you, because the last time Alexandre came to Hong Kong and he gave a presentation over there, then he met a student over there, and this student is now a postdoc at MIT and collaborating with Alexandre. So maybe there is some chance for you to, become a colleague of Alexandre, and also Florian, the other MIT speaker from today at MIT. So. So thank you very much, Alexandre, for coming, for doing this, and we very much look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you, Achim. I'm going to share my screen. Give me just 1 second.
Sure.
Can you all see my slides? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great, thank you. So good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on where you are. Thank you, Achim, for the very kind introduction. It's a pleasure for me to be here. And yes, indeed, I've had the pleasure to visit Achim at PolyU maybe a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago, and I've met Kai Wong, a PhD student at the time there, and it's been a pleasure to work with him since then. So that's been a very fruitful partnership. So I'm indeed an assistant professor of operations research and statistics at MIT at the Sloan School of Management. Most of my interests lie in applying data-driven optimization, data-driven decision-making, and stochastic optimization for problems in transportation industries, and air transportation in particular. Yes, Nicole. Already a question?
Sorry, you turned your video off, and it would be really nice if you could turn it back on.
Oh,
so that I can see you and the slides, if possible.
Okay. Okay, I'll do that. Give me 1 second.
Actually, it seems that there are two video windows from you, one without video and one with video.
Yes, indeed. I've had some trouble with my audio. So can you hear me from my computer? Is it okay?
Yeah, it's okay.
Yes, okay, great. Okay, great. So thanks, Nicole, for pointing that out. I indeed connected twice. So so in this talk, what I'm going to share with you is a recent paper that is called Predictive and Prescriptive Analytics Toward Passenger-Centric Ground Delay Programs. So in the grand scheme of things, what I'm doing here is I am revisiting a canonical problem in air transportation operations research, which is the ground delay program, or air traffic flow management in more generally. And I'm trying to reconcile two objectives. One is how to make it efficient from like the perspective of flights or flight flows. And number two is how to make it consistent with passenger itineraries. And as I'm gonna try to argue, these two objectives may or may not coincide perfectly. And how do I do this? Basically through optimization. So for those of you who are not familiar, optimization includes mainly mathematical programming methods that that includes models and algorithms in order to solve these types of very, very large scale problems in spatial temporal networks. where the decisions are tightly coupled, and the question is how to develop algorithms that enable us to find the optimal solution, or like a close to optimal solution in reasonable computational times. So that's the prescriptive part of today. And then there is a predictive part, which stems from the fact that passenger itineraries are not necessarily known during the day of operations. And so in addition to just doing optimization, I also apply machine learning techniques in order to predict passenger itineraries and then use these predictions into optimization in order to make sure that the proposal here, or the proposed approach, can be implemented in the current operating environment with the information that is available today. So that's an overview of what I'm going to talk about. So just to get started, I mean, and putting things into context, I've been very fortunate to work in transportation for the past decade, basically. It's a sector that has seen a lot of developments recently. We've seen the emergence of new business models with all the connected platforms that we are using, at least when we are getting out of the house these days. We can use like all the Uber and Lyft, but all for personal transportation, but also I would say the platforms for freight transportation and trucking and this type of thing. So we have really like a more connected transportation system that provides more opportunities to improve operations as well as improve planning. The second aspect is that we have new vehicle technologies. We have now connected vehicles, automated vehicles, and we have completely new concept. On the right here is the concept of an electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, which is basically the closest thing we know from flying cars. And there are like a lot of developments right now, which is like these technologies are on the verge of becoming available. The question is, how do we organize the systems and how do we make them work at scale? And then in all of these, there is like still one core question, which is the first one here, which is how should we manage the systems when demand grows, or at least demand is strong and capacity is limited, highway capacity is limited, or in our case, airport capacity is limited. And how to manage these mismatches is one of the core questions in this research. So the broader question, I think, in the field here is really how to unlock the benefits of mobility and accessibility and transportation while sustaining profitable growth for operators and mitigating the consequences from a public standpoint, including congestion, environmental emissions, and other externalities. So I'm going to talk about these questions in the context of air transportation or air traffic management. So on the right here, you can see the growth in passenger traffic over the past 50, 60 years. So obviously today we would have a very big drop with COVID, but that aside, there's been like a very sustained growth since basically the 1970s, especially the end of the 1970s when the US airline industry got deregulated, followed by a lot of liberalization agreements worldwide. And this growth has obviously provided a ton of benefits, but at the same time created some operational challenges, mainly because capacity has remained limited. This is a map of the airports in the US. Obviously, we don't have too many airports, and the airports that we have finite capacity. So the question is how to manage this while abiding by the capacity of that. And the consequence of this can be significant. And here is one of an illustration of the main one is that imbalances between demand and capacity can result in severe delays with very significant costs for the US airline industry, for passengers, and for like the broader economy. So in the United States, the nationwide cost of delays were estimated at over $30 billion for a single year, which is obviously a sizable impact. So there are a number of interventions for congestion mitigation. I mean, I just want to point out two of them, and then I'm going to focus on the one that I'm focusing on. So there is one that is strategic, which is something that Achim and I and others have spent a lot of time thinking of, which is how to design slot allocation or schedule coordination or demand management policies that will make sure that next season we don't have too many flights scheduled as compared to available capacity. So this is a strategic intervention that can take the form of, again, slot allocation or slot control, that can take the form of congestion pricing, slot auctions, and so on. Today, I'm going to talk about another one, which is more tactical, which is called air traffic flow management. This is a video of the air traffic management system in the United States for a typical day of work, for a typical day. And what is basically crucial here is how to optimize these operations in order to minimize the cost of delays for a given schedule of flights. So unlike demand management, the schedule of flights is now fixed. And the question is, how do we operate this in the least cost manner? Okay. And again, we have capacity at the nodes, we have capacity constraints at the various airports. So in bad days, we're gonna have delays. If demand is too high or capacity is too low, we're gonna have delays. The question becomes how to operate this in the least cost manner, how to minimize the costs of delays. Okay. And one of the core interventions here is known as ground delay program. So let me basically tell you the idea of ground delay programs as it was developed in the 80s and the 90s. Suppose that a big node, like let's say all the airports in New York, will be facing a capacity drop in 5 hours, right? Because it's going to be raining in New York in 5 hours, and we are just losing 10 or 20% of capacity there. Okay. We have a lot of flights that are scheduled to land in New York. The question is, instead of having these flights take off as soon as they're ready, and then queue around New York in the because of the capacity constraints, instead of that, we will hold the flights at the departure airport, where they're much easier to operate, much cheaper, much more environmentally, much less environmentally damaging. So we're going to hold them for 10 or 15 minutes, and then they're going to take off and go directly to the runway in New York. Right? That's the idea of a ground delay program. We're absorbing the delay on the ground as opposed to in the terminal airspace. So then further development embedded that with in en route operations. So instead of like just absorbing the delays on the ground, we can also use speed and routing as additional instruments for more flexibility. And then there has been a lot of work that falls under what's known as collaborative decision making, which is how to make all of these decisions when you have different stakeholders with competing interests. Air traffic management at the centralized level, and competing airlines at the decentralized levels that may not have the same preference. So in the field of operations research and air traffic management, this is one of the important success stories of the past 20 years. These GDPs, ground delay programs, with collaborative decision making are now routinely implemented in the US, in Europe, in Asia on a daily basis. The paper I'm presenting today has basically one observation, is that all of that has basically one objective, which is minimizing flight delays. The problem is that flight delays and passenger delays are not necessarily perfectly correlated. And the question that I'm asking here is, how can we make these decisions more consistent with passenger itineraries, with passenger preference? And to do that, I'm using, again, mathematical programming and large-scale optimization for a simple reason, is that all of these operational decisions need to be made in very complex networks of operations. What we do at 9 a.m. impacts what we do at 11 a.m. What we do in New York impacts what we can and cannot do in Los Angeles. And so to capture all of that, we need to account for all the coupling between the decisions which results in very complex decision space, and therefore can be solved with computational optimization algorithms. Okay, any questions so far? Checking the chat. So feel free to use the chat for questions or to jump in directly.
Yeah, I was also mentioning this in the chat. I just have one quick question, and this is, you mentioned the ground delay programs, then the speed and routing. If you would have to rank those in terms of importance, who would come first, and which one came first, and so on.
Usually the first one will be the ground delay, because this is actually, number one, the easiest to implement, and number two, the most efficient, because if you're like just waiting on the ground, let's say the emissions are much lower and the operational complexity is much lower. Number two would be speed control, which is a fairly easy instrument to implement, and also that has a direct impact again on fuel burn, operating cost, and environmental emissions. The last one will be routing. It's like really when your routing is only necessary when you're dealing with congested airspace, as opposed to in addition to congested airports. In the US, this is still relatively minor. I would say that 90% of the delays come from airports, 10% come from airspace. In Europe, it's much more important because it's more 50-50. The airspace is much more congested in Europe than it is in the US.
In terms of my question was, it's not the convenience in a way, but the practical importance. So if you think about how you mitigated it, is ground delay, are these ground delay programs implemented, and are they the dominant measure to handle delays, or is it speed, or is it routing?
Yeah, the GDPs have been implemented early and is still like the primary instrument. Speed and routing fall under what is known as airspace flow programs, at least in the US, and they're usually seen as, like, I would say, a second resort.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Good. Thank you. Thank you.
No? Other questions? So again, feel free. I have the chat open, so if you have questions, feel free to put them here. Okay, so this paper proposes a passenger-centric approach to GDP that balances two objectives: flight delays and passenger delays. So I'm just going to very quickly summarize, I would say, like an analytical model of passenger operations, just to clarify a little bit the type of trade-offs that I'm considering. But then the main part that I want to emphasize is an optimization model to actually make these decisions in large-scale spatial temporal networks. Then I want to provide some results, and basically what the perspective I'm taking here is, let us assume that we knew perfectly the passenger itineraries. What could we do? Okay. And then in the last part, I'm going to relax that assumption and predict itineraries and then optimize operations. Okay, so this is the analytical model that I just briefly mentioned. So assume a very simple setting. Assume that you have a facility, let's say an airport, okay, that has finite capacity, a service rate. And then you have arriving vehicles. You don't control them. You just have arriving flight at the airport. Some of them are close, some of them are further away, but you basically have arrivals. Each of these arriving vehicles carry passengers or packages if you're talking about logistics, okay? Then you have departing vehicles. They're all ready. You have P departing vehicles. They're all ready to depart right now. The question is, which one should you operate first, if any? And the decision can be operate nothing and wait. Why would you wait? Why would you wait? Because some passengers will connect from arriving vehicles to departing vehicles. So here I have two objectives. Number one is I want to minimize the delays of these departing vehicles and the passengers that are in the departing vehicles waiting to go to their destination. But number two, I want to minimize the costs of passenger misconnecting. If I operate one departing vehicle, then all the arriving passengers here, all the connecting passengers, when they arrive, they will miss their connections to that vehicle, to that flight. Okay, so that's the key trade-off. So I'm happy to share the paper upon request. There is like, this is formulated as a dynamic programming model. We find the optimal policy in under some conditions. And basically we highlight 3 takeaways. Number 1 is that there is an important lever for these types of operations, which is delay, what I call delay allocation. In other words, I have finite capacity here. I have a lot of departing vehicles. I'm going to have delays. The question is which vehicle to prioritize versus which vehicle to delay. And I do that in order to manage, again, passenger costs. The second one actually is interesting as well, is that there is a delay reallocation lever. As soon as I have an arrival at the facility, my priorities can change. And so I can update the priority order of my departing vehicles. And the last one is highlights the fact that under some conditions, it is actually optimal to operate no departures at all and to wait in order to enable passengers to connect and then to go to their final destination. And so I find this quite interesting because basically what we're doing sometimes is that we are introducing delays, flight delays, vehicle delays, in order to reduce delays, passenger delays. Okay, so we're starting to see a trade-off. And then we have some further insights that we're basically, I mean, if you're a departing vehicle, you're going to be prioritized if you have more passengers, if you're waiting for fewer connections, if the incoming vehicles are closer, and if the missed connections are less costly. So these type of things are like relatively straightforward, or like I would say intuitive. But what is interesting is that we are going to observe very similar insights in our realistic setting. So I'm going to come back to these takeaways later. So what I also want to highlight from a modeling standpoint is that, you know, this is very nice because we can obtain an optimal policy, we can get analytical results. The problem is that we're looking here at like one airport, very stylized setting, everything follows a Poisson process and all that. So, you know, we have a very, very stylized modeling setting here, when in practice, you need to make these decisions at scale, in space, and over time. And again, what you do at one airport impacts what you do at other airports, for example. So let's consider a simple setting. Each gray circle is an airport. Each blue arrow is a flight. And then what is important is that then, so that's, I mean, on top of that flight network, we have a passenger network. Some passengers have non-stop flights, but some passengers have itineraries that are connecting at one airport, going from airport A to airport C through airport B. And here we have a connection, okay? But that flight, this one that you're seeing here, can be the first leg for that passenger itinerary, but can be also the second leg for another passenger itinerary. So it's much less clear whether that flight should be prioritized or not, because we have very strongly competing interests here. So to optimize these decisions, I basically formulate an optimization model, a mixed integer optimization model. The main decision that I'm making is when to operate every single flight. So this is represented by these decision variables. So consider a matrix where each row is a flight and each column is a time period. So for that flight, this is a row, right? I'm going to have a bunch of zeros and a bunch of ones, and the first one represents the time when I operate, okay? So that's the type of integer or binary, in that case, decision variables that we're working with in optimization. And so in that case, my flight will depart in period 5. And this, I have a similar decision variables for arrivals, and I will arrive in period 9 in that case, okay? And then at the same time, I'm adding what I call indirect decision variables, which is passenger accommodation. So why indirect? Indirect because the decision maker in my model is an air traffic manager, an air traffic manager, a centralized air traffic manager, the FAA in the US, Eurocontrol or air traffic controllers in Europe, and so on. But passenger accommodations are not decided by decentralized decision makers. They're actually the decisions of the airline. So these are called indirect decision variables because I want to anticipate what is going to happen for passengers as well as I can, but I'm not making these decisions in practice. So in other words, the goal here is to really optimize flight operations, my decisions, while capturing what is going to happen for other decisions. So basically what I'm doing here is I am tracking with Lambda PI which connections are feasible and which ones are not. Okay, so if, for example, my first leg is delayed, my second leg is not delayed, then I may not have sufficient connecting time between the two. So that is going to be flagged as a 1. This is infeasible. And then I'm just tracking the number of passengers that are accommodated on every single itinerary. Does that make sense? No question? Feel free to use the chat again. And this is the model. So again, for those of you who are not familiar with optimization, an optimization model maximizes or minimizes an objective function. So here I'm minimizing a cost function, subject to a number of constraints that capture all the coupling parts that I have mentioned before. So let me talk to you a little bit about this. Basically, the left-hand side here is a standard ground delay program model, okay? I'm minimizing aircraft delay costs subject to flight operating constraints and airport capacity constraints. Ground delay programs 101, no passenger considerations. The right-hand part here is what is new in this model. So let me talk to you about the objective function, which I think is the most important part. So the objective function has two components, flight delays or aircraft delay and passenger delays. Rho is a trade-off parameter. If rho is equal to 0, I just minimize flight delays back to the old days, back to like ground delay, flight-centric ground delay programs. When rho increases, I'm becoming more and more conscious of passenger itineraries, and I'm willing to sacrifice more in terms of flight delays in order to reduce passenger delays. And as I vary rho, I optimize the trade-off between these two objectives. So the first term here at the bottom is flight delays, arrivals plus departures. Going back to Arim's question, we are having a higher cost for arrival delay than departure delay. And that will basically make sure that we absorb the flight delays on the ground rather than in the air whenever it is possible. Now, the second part of this objective function is indeed the passenger delay. So here, what I'm doing here is that I am including the delay of non-stop passengers. In other words, all else equal, if one flight has 500 passengers and another one has 50, delaying the first one by 10 minutes is more costly than delaying the second one by 10 minutes, okay? So this is captured by this function. So this is delay here, and then NP is wait with non-stop passengers. Nothing crazy so far, because it's still like, we can still kind of decouple the objective at the level of each flight. But the last part is very much a new part here. And this is the...
Alexandre, can I ask one question? So the aircraft delay costs and the passenger delay costs, definitely they are highly correlated, right?
Yes, so far they are. But there is like I think the last term is really what breaks the correlation. It's the cost of misconnections. So basically, whenever you have a connection that is missed by a passenger, that passenger will have to be reaccommodated on different flights in order to reach his or her final destination. And there is a huge cost associated with that, which is that delta parameter here. And now, if, for example, I increase my second leg delay by, let's say, 15 minutes, then I can reduce passenger delays by, I don't know, 5 hours because it's much more convenient for the passenger to do that. Mm-hmm. But that 5 hours depends a lot on which market you're looking at. Boston, New York has a flight every hour. If I miss connection, I'm just gonna have 1 hour. Boston, Cincinnati has maybe one flight per day. So if I miss my connection, then maybe I have to spend a night in Boston and actually fly the next day. So we are capturing all of these things that actually, I think, break the correlation between flight and passenger delays because of the misconnection, because the networks are not perfectly aligned, because we have connecting itineraries.
I see. Yeah, thank you.
Make sense? Okay, so so that's the objective function. So I'm going to talk a lot about these two objectives. So flight delay altogether and passenger delay altogether as a function of rho. Remember rho, trade-off parameter. So then we have, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but flight operating constraints, I'm basically making sure I'm not breaking the laws of physics. I have minimum connecting time. I have, if I'm scheduled at 9, I cannot leave before 9, you know, this type of like very simple things. Then we have airport capacity constraints that ensure that what I'm operating at the airport is consistent with the capacity of the airport. This is actually the main operational constraint. These are captured by these types of envelope between number of arrivals versus number of departures. And these depend on weather conditions. Good weather, poor weather. We obviously can do more when it's sunny than when it's raining. All of these constraints so far are very standard. I've done nothing. Now I'm adding new decision variables now in order to define which itineraries are feasible and which ones are infeasible. So in other words, what I'm doing here is I'm capturing the endogeneity of the feasibility of passenger itineraries with respect to my flight decision variables. These are linked and I'm capturing it here. Basically what this constraint says is very simple, is saying that if the duration between my arrival and my departure is less than a minimum connecting time, then lambda will be equal to 1. It will be infeasible. If not, lambda will be equal to 0. It will be feasible. And I have a proposition that shows that these constraints capture the simple rules of physics that I just described. And finally, I have constraints that say that all passengers need to be accommodated somewhere on some flight, can be the next day. Each aircraft has a number of seats, right? So I need to abide by that as well. And then I have some consistency constraints, saying here, for example, that if lambda is equal to 1, meaning that it is infeasible to connect between that flight and that flight, then z will be equal to 1, meaning that no one will connect, to 0, meaning that no one will connect there. So, you know, this type of like simple constraints here. And I have another proposition that shows that these are actually tight constraints, which means that they are actually defining a strong formulation. And I'm happy to talk more about that offline. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip the algorithm. Achim, I have, how long do I have?
So we plan to have 1 hour for your presentation.
Okay, so I'll try to go until like 9:10 or 9:15.
But we are
with questions.
basically we are flexible. We have, I mean, we have the school, but I do believe that we have enough, you know, buffer time. So we also have some answers questions session afterwards. Okay. So yeah, you know,
thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to talk about the rolling algorithm very, very quickly. Just the idea is that this is a very, very, very complex problem. There are millions, literally millions of decisions and millions of constraints to account for if we want to actually solve that for the entire network in the United States for the entire day of operations. So if you give that to an optimization solver, basically it will die trying. And maybe in millions of years, it will tell you, oh, by the way, that's what you should have done millions of years ago. So a key challenge in operations research is to design algorithms that can give us optimal solutions or close to optimal solutions in reasonable computational times. And the way I do it in this paper, and I'm going to skip the details, is to only solve for 4, 5, or 6 hours at a time. And I resolve every hour. So it's a kind of a rolling algorithm or a resolving heuristic where I optimize for 6 hours. So I optimize from 6 to 12. And then at 7, I re-optimize from 7 to 1. And then at 8 a.m., I re-optimize from 8 to 2, and so on and so forth. I implement the model using real-world data. We have very good data on flights and airport capacities. We don't have very good data on passengers because these are proprietary to the airlines. However, a recent database from Barnhart, Fearing, and Vase reconstructed passenger itineraries in flight networks, and I'm using these data in order to calibrate the model. And what I'm going to do here is to generate ground delay program instances. So I'm going to consider instances with 6, 18, and 30 airports. So 30 airports means basically the entire US. And then I'm going to consider good and poor weather, meaning good weather means mild capacity constraints, and poor weather means strong capacity constraints. So low delays, high delays in a way. So I said before that I'm only solving for 6 hours at a time. Still, every time I have to optimize up to 14,000 flights and 65,000 passenger itineraries. So we're still dealing with a very large scale optimization problem. So here are some results. Let's look at this table in some detail. So the first part of the table is when I optimize for 4 hours at a time. The bottom part of the table is when I optimize for 6 hours at a time. And at the end of the day, when I optimize for 6 hours at a time, I end up basically with a total cost that is lower by 1 to 6 to 7%. So that actually shows the benefits of solving large scale optimization problems because we're actually capturing more of these coupling constraints. If I do 4 hours, I am behaving more myopically. But that obviously comes at a cost, meaning that the computational times can be more significant than when I'm considering a smaller instance. And then there is another thing that is very interesting is that the first column here shows the model of GDP without passengers. Okay, so the flight-centric flight-centric GDP. So I would say state-of-the-art model. On the right, the two columns, here I'm now incorporating the passengers. So this is the model that I presented with two different values of rho. And in blue, we can see that the computational times is not that different on the right versus on the left. What that means is that we are able to incorporate passenger considerations at moderate costs in terms of computational times. And from a practical standpoint, it's very important because some variant of the model on the left is implemented in practice. I'm proposing models on the right. The question is, are you going to completely break down our software systems? And the answer here seems to be no. So now what I'm showing is practical results. And this is perhaps one of the most important takeaways, is that what I'm showing here is that we have a very nice trade-off between flight delay and passenger delay. Let's look at this row, for example. Okay, so under poor weather, I am able to reduce passenger delays by 20% by increasing flight delays by only 0.5%. So if we take just a little bit of additional cost, we can make operations much more consistent with passenger preferences. If we are able to increase passenger delays by up to 3%, then I can reduce passenger delays by 60%. So again, there's a lot we can do for passengers at relatively low cost in terms of flight delay. Under good weather, it's even better because we have more flexibility. Actually, under good weather, I'm able to reduce both non-stop and one-stop passenger delays by a lot, whereas under poor weather, there is only so much I can do. I'm so constrained that I cannot really have the luxury to re-accommodate delay in order to reduce non-stop passenger delay. However, I'm still able to avoid a number of misconnections. Okay. So the main takeaway here is that we can achieve very strong passenger delay reductions at relatively small costs in terms of added flight delays. So from a technical standpoint, what I have shown here is the impact on the objective function. The question is, how do we do that? How do we get there? From a practical standpoint, what is the decision that I'm making and how am I making that differently from before? And so what I'm showing here is the average departure delay, a histogram, as a function of the number of non-stop passenger per flight. And each bar represents a value of rho. So when I go from dark to light, I'm basically giving more and more importance to passengers and less importance to flights. So when I care more about passengers, I'm going to delay more the flights that have few non-stop passengers, and I'm going to delay less the flights that have a lot of non-stop passengers. So I'm reallocating delays from the small aircraft to the jumbo aircraft. Sorry, no, the opposite. From the big aircraft to the small aircraft. Now I'm doing the same thing as a function of outgoing connection. So suppose that you have a, let's say, Lisbon, Frankfurt, St. Petersburg itinerary. So, okay, so someone going from Lisbon to St. Petersburg, connecting in Frankfurt. Let's consider Frankfurt Airport. From the perspective of that airport, Frankfurt St. Petersburg is called an outgoing connect. Sorry. Let's consider the Lisbon Airport. From the perspective of that airport, Lisbon Frankfurt is called an outgoing connection, meaning that it's going to be the first leg of a two-leg itinerary. So what I'm showing here is that when I have few outgoing connections, I'm going to be delayed more, because vice versa, if I have a lot of outgoing connection, if a lot of people are going from Lisbon to St. Petersburg, then if I delay Lisbon Frankfurt, it's going to have a lot of downstream impact. Okay, so I'm reallocating delay from the flight that have a lot of outgoing connections to those that have very few. And vice versa, from the perspective of Frankfurt, the Lisbon Frankfurt is an incoming connection. And here I have the opposite insight, which is that when I have a lot of incoming connections, I'm going to delay these flights more, because basically I'm waiting for passengers to connect and then I'm going, which is very consistent with the analytical insights that I presented before. So to summarize, this is the first column here is the flight-centric ATFM models. And the next three columns are the proposed model with increasing emphasis on passengers. And what I'm showing is that I can reduce drastically the number of misconnections. How do I do that? By shifting the delay from the big aircraft to the small aircraft, by shifting the delay from those that have a lot of outgoing connections to those that have few outgoing connections, and by shifting the delay to those that have incoming connections. All of that basically ensures that we are preserving passenger connectivity. And I have an excellent question from Nicole, which is, am I going to hurt the low-cost carrier against the legacy carrier? And that was actually one of my concerns. I don't have the results here, but I have that in the paper I'm happy to share, is that basically the share of airline delay remains relatively similar, meaning that we are not hurting airlines as opposed to others, meaning that we are also ensuring equity in that regard. It's a very good question for future research, how to do that deliberately and make sure that it doesn't occur, but at least we don't have that adverse impact in this case. Any other question? No. So, so I want to conclude with one part. So far, what I've done is I've done basically optimization, which is here is a problem, here is a model for this problem, here is an algorithm, and here are results, and here is the impact. This works really well when you have perfect information regarding your inputs. The problem here is that we don't really have perfect information regarding passenger itineraries. Remember that my decision maker is an air traffic manager. Who has information about passenger itineraries? It's the airlines. When I show the results that there are strong benefits of doing this type of approach, ultimately, the hope, the vision is that passenger itineraries could be shared by the airlines as part of the collaborative decision-making program, meaning that there is some data exchange, there is some information exchange going on right now on a variety of operational problems. However, passenger itineraries are not part of that data exchange. So ideally, that would be done that way. But it raises a number of questions, and all the game theoretic people in the room or in the virtual room would say, oh, but that creates a number of incentives. How do we make sure that this information is revealed truthfully? How do we ensure equity, and so on and so forth? In the current operating environment, we don't even have that information. And that was actually another question that Nicole asked last time I presented this paper. And so basically, this is the response to this concern now. It's like, what if I don't know? What if I don't know which passengers connect where? And so what I'm doing here is I'm going to use historical data on passenger itineraries, which we have through the database that I'm using here. And how can I use this data to predict today's itineraries and use these predictions for the optimization? Okay. And if this is flight-centric GDP, this is passenger-centric GDP, with this impartial information, am I closer to here, in between? Where am I? Okay, in terms of performance. So basically what I'm doing is this. I'm training a machine learning model using yesterday's data, literally yesterday. If I'm optimizing operations from today, I'm using yesterday's data, training models here, and then I'm predicting out of sample, of course, itineraries for today. I'm using these to optimize operations, and then I'm assessing the resulting solution as compared to the flight-centric baseline and the full information perfect ideal solution, the one that I presented just before. So we have two problems from a predictive standpoint. We have a regression problem, which or where I'm trying to predict the number of non-stop passengers on each flight. Okay, so that's a numerical value that can be between basically 50 and 250, something like this. Right? And then I have a classification problem where I'm trying to predict on which flight pairs I'm going to have a connection. For example, a simple example, Lisbon, Frankfurt, Frankfurt, St. Petersburg, I need to predict one. Lisbon, Frankfurt, Frankfurt, Porto, I'm going to predict a 0 because it makes no sense to connect here. But obviously, these are simple examples. In others, it can be more complicated. So my independent variables, my predictors, my features, depending on whether you're statisticians or computer scientists, include temporal information, so the time of departure, arrival, and connection, spatial information, like where the airports are, the distance, the airline, some have more connecting passengers than others, and then the itinerary quality, trying to say that Frankfurt is a great connection from Lisbon to St. Petersburg, Frankfurt is not so great from Lisbon to Porto, okay? And so I have a number of detour type of variables in order to capture these. For both problems, I'm obtaining the best performance with random forest models. I'm happy to share details if you're interested. And this is basically the resulting performance. So on the left, you can see the scatter plot of predicted versus observed number of non-stop passengers for the first problem. Okay, on each flight, how many non-stop passengers do I have? And basically, this is the 45-degree line, and we're not too far from it. The R square is 94–95%. The mean absolute error is 9 passengers, so not too bad. The classification problem is also pretty strong. This is the false positive rate against the true positive rate. And in red, you're seeing what's called the receiver operating curve, the ROC, for the random forest model, the best one. And we're getting an area under the curve of 95. Again, 0.5 means very bad. 1 means perfect prediction. So 95 is pretty good. So again, that was actually a pretty strong result. To my knowledge, this is the first time we're trying to predict, to infer passenger itineraries based on these types of historical data and machine learning models. And this shows that there is scope for pretty strong prediction in that regard. The main drivers of the prediction will be basically the characteristics of the OD market and the airline. But for connecting itineraries, the main one is actually the quality of the itinerary. So how long is the layover? What is the distance? So again, trying to distinguish Lisbon, St. Petersburg versus Lisbon, Porto for Frankfurt. So here's what I'm doing. I have my machine learning model. I'm making my predictions. With these predictions, I'm getting my solution using the same optimization model as before. Now I need to assess that, but I need to assess that against the actual itineraries. Okay, so when I'm going to report costs, I'm going to account for the fact that my predictions have errors, and then I have imperfect information. Okay. One final note is that the classification model yields a range of predictions. So if I go back to the ROC curve, sorry, that's taking a while because these are big pictures. Sorry, give me 1 second. Oh yeah, here. Okay, if I go back to the ROC curve, I can actually make different predictions. Here, here, or here in a way. So here I'm predicting few itineraries. I'm making very small false positives, but I'm making a lot of false negatives. Vice versa, if I'm operating here, I'm predicting a lot of predictions, and I'm going to make a lot of false positives and fewer false negatives. Okay, so here we can decide if we want to be aggressive or conservative in a way in our predictive passenger itineraries. So I'm capturing that with kappa. So low kappa means I'm predicting, sorry, actually there's a typo here. Low kappa means few itineraries, high kappa means many itineraries. So this is actually the main result of this section. So let me explain these in detail, and then we can wrap up. So y-axis on the left is flight delay. Y-axis on the right is passenger delay. X-axis is rho. What does rho mean? Again, from left to right, I'm giving more and more prominence to passenger delay. Red is what I obtain with my previous optimization model using perfect information. Okay. Black is what I obtain if I ignore the passenger itineraries. Okay. So this is flight-centric GDP in black, and in red, it is passenger-centric GDP with perfect information. So the fact that I can reduce a lot passenger delays at a small cost in flight delays between black and red is exactly what I said before, 5 slides ago. But now the question is, with imperfect information, where do I stand? And one of the very interesting results to me is that this bar, for example, shows that I can bridge most of the gap from black to red, from flight-centric to perfect information, okay? Even without full knowledge of passenger itineraries. In other words, if I do predict, then optimize, I'm getting basically 90% of the way or 80% of the way from the flight-centric baseline to the ideal perfect information outcome. And from a practical standpoint, this is a major finding, I think, because we're saying that even in the current operating environment where that information is not shared, we can actually have benefits of passenger-centric operations. So this concludes my presentation. What I wanted to outline, to emphasize maybe at the end is, and first of all, the power of optimization modeling for solving these complex problems in spatial temporal networks, to capturing coupling constraints over time and over space. A lot of work in my field involves modeling these type of problems and developing algorithms that can solve them in reasonable computational times. The second takeaway is that flight and passenger delays are not correlated, and therefore there is opportunities to reduce drastically passenger delays at comparatively small costs in terms of flight delays. And third is that in many settings, the parameters or the inputs of these types of decision-making problems are not known with perfect accuracy. And there is an important opportunity that involves learning these inputs with historical data using machine learning models. And actually, from a methodological standpoint, there is a lot of work right now that is trying to do these types of predict, then optimize methods. I have some ongoing work in that in order to understand better how we can merge machine learning based predictions and optimization based decisions. So this concludes my talk. Thank you very much for your attention and again for the invitation, and I'm happy to take other questions.
Good, excellent. Yeah, thank you very much. This was definitely very exciting, and you know, also something that I like about your presentation, you can always see how passionate and enthusiastic you are about, you know, these things. I think that's something very important, actually. That all these problems, once you're getting deeper and deeper into this, you're getting more involved, and sort of the passion grows. Yeah. And it's yeah. So this is good to see that it you know. That you can convey this also, because this is a junior workshop, right, to the young researchers.
Yeah,
so
yeah, exactly.
Actually, it is really an exciting area. And I guess, I don't know, sometimes does it happen to you that you do something and you can't sleep because you're so excited? Does it happen to you?
Yeah, the most beautiful thing about research is that the more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know. And
absolutely,
we are lucky.
Yeah, I fully agree. I fully agree with this. Okay, but let's move to the questions. I'm sure that there are many questions. Hans Martin?
Yeah, hi. So thank you for really fascinating. I have no idea of operational research, but so the question is more how to use it. Now, assume that on the strategic level, we have something better than the current slot system. So let's say, or so that we have optimal prices. Yeah.
Yeah.
Then still your work would make a lot of sense. Is that true or not? Or would that be solved by the behavior of the airlines, airports, passengers, and so on?
Okay, good question. I'm going to answer, I think, in 3 ways. Number one is to say, I'm not going to talk about optimal prices yet or optimal slot levels yet. I'm going to say that if we're super aggressive at the strategic level, and if our capacity is between 60 and 80 per hour, and for some reason we ship for 40 flights per hour, this is not needed, right? Because there is no delay, there's nothing to fix. If we're super conservative, US style type of demand management policies, then this is strongly needed, because now we're scheduling more than 80 per hour, and we're going to have delays no matter what. And as soon as it's training, we're going to have large delays. In between, so now I'm getting into more like the optimal pricing part. When we are doing that trade-off, we're going to have some delays, maybe not as strong as in the US, but non-zero. So this is still going to be needed at the tactical level, meaning that no matter what was done 6 months ago, I still need to operate my flights today, and I need to operate my flights in the least cost manner. So that's where I think the scope of that work is. So that's one direction. Once we have made the strategic decisions, slot control, slot auctions, consistent pricing, whatever, or nothing like in the US, probably suboptimal, but that's a different question. Then today, how to operate in a least cost way. That's the scope of that paper. The work that I've done in the context of demand management actually looks at the other way around. And what I'm trying to argue, what I was trying to argue in a series of papers is to say that the decisions that we're making at the strategic level depend on what we can and cannot do at the operating level. And what I mean by that is that I view this as, I would say, the first lever to pull. The reason is that we want to be efficient at the operational level. There is very little economic cost in operating well, right? As opposed to demand management interventions that have some cost, price or displacement, I mean, depending on what mechanism we're looking at. So that's the first lever to pull. And then the way I was optimizing schedule coordination or scheduling interventions at the strategic level is to say, given how we operate, given how we pull that operational lever, how do we anticipate that at the strategic level? So in other words, how to capture the endogeneity of operations when it comes to optimizing scheduling. Granted, I've only done that in non-monetary mechanisms and not in pricing mechanisms. So I think that there is actually a fairly interesting research opportunity, which is like how to optimize congestion pricing mechanisms that can actually capture, I would say, the recourse of operating procedures. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Nicole?
So it's really fun. The deal is that it's an integer program, so we don't get the prices, correct? So we couldn't just, to answer Hans Martin, we can't use the dual price to argue the value of the delay and so on, right?
Correct. If we were living in a world where flights were continuous and not binary, we would actually be able to inform congestion pricing and this type of things by using shadow prices or dual variables, depending on whether you're an economist or an operations researcher. But here we cannot, because we have integer variables, and so we don't have duality properties or strong duality properties. Correct.
Okay, but so that's actually something to think about, whether we can move towards, for example, using time or timing slots and thus go back to sort of linear or whatever, to go back to that world to talk about pricing.
Correct. I agree.
How long does it take to solve this problem? And I'm assuming you did a trade-off between doing like 4-hour, 6-hour, 8-hour rolling horizons. How did you come up with your 6-hour story?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Basically here I have, so at each, remember, I'm solving that for like something like 15 times during a day, because I'm doing that every hour, right? And so the median time is in seconds here. So from 20 seconds to 100 seconds, median time for 4 hours. For 6 hours, I'm going from basically 30 seconds to 3 minutes, sorry, 30 seconds to 3 minutes. So still consistent, I think, with implementation requirements. These are, I would say that these are tactical interventions, ground delay programs, right? It's like, what do we do for the next 6 hours? It's not like real time, so it doesn't have to be like milliseconds. It cannot be hours, but it doesn't have to be milliseconds. 7-8 hours, I actually ran into memory problems here, on my own computer, and so that's very simply why I stopped at 6 hours. I think that the broader argument is that there exist software systems today that are in place that implement the left version. I think that changing the underlying optimization routine in these software systems in order to move from left to right would add some computational cost that would be, however, not too drastic, and that I think would retain computational tractability. That's what I'm trying to argue, as opposed to really saying we should do 4, we should do 6, because that depends on, you know, a software architecture that is beyond the scope of what I'm looking at.
So how are you going, do you handle international flights that will have left already and can't be stopped versus the more local stuff?
Yes.
Do you take all of that into account?
Yes. So in that routing algorithm, actually, there is a lot of actually. This was the fastest slide today. It was the longest slide in terms of underlying work because there are a lot of things to account for here. So at each hour, you have flights that are en route. Too late, too bad. But then at the same time, when you are making decisions during 4, 5, 6 hours, then your passenger, the ripple effects on passenger itineraries are for the entire day. So you need to account for that. So basically what I'm trying to say is that this problem is nice, but these constraints, especially these constraints actually, need to be modified quite a bit for the routing algorithm to account exactly for the type of thing that you mentioned. Have details in the paper.
Cool. So you could actually sell this. You could organize a startup and.
Sure. I'll think about it in 6 to 9 years.
I also have.
But the goal is to do something implementable. More importantly than commercialization. I mean, what I'm trying to argue here is that systems are in place today. I mean, admittedly, the airline industry is not too concerned about delays at this present hour, but it's going to come back, and there are systems that are in place, and I think that there is opportunity to make the systems more efficient, more reliable using this type of approach. That's the belief here. Achim?
Yeah. So your objective function, you had the role, right? Yeah. I can see where you came from because, you know, the current system is an aircraft delay concentrated 100%, and then you add a little bit of passenger delay. From my own perspective as a passenger, and I would say I don't care about aircraft delay. The only thing I care is about passenger delay. And is this the better way? But, you know, I think it's just interesting to have an objective function that, you know, puts zero weight on aircraft and only on passenger delay because it's sort of on the other side of the spectrum. And then you can sort of, you know, give a little bit more complete picture on how that may be looking like. And if it would be,
sorry.
Yeah, and then I think that's something I think in order for illustration, I think purposes that could be quite interesting, but even for practical purposes.
So I agree. Actually, rho equals 0.01 is basically rho equal infinity in that case, meaning that there is only so much you can do in terms of passenger delay reductions, and that so much is 90% versus 96% in poor and good weather. And you wouldn't get much more than that, I think. But that's a good point, and I need to clarify that. The other thing is that as a passenger, we care about passenger delay, correct? An airline cares about both components. And actually, what is also interesting is that oftentimes this is misconstrued as to saying that it's airline delay versus passenger delay. That's not true. It's flight delays versus passenger delays. Airline costs encompasses both, because passenger misconnections have costs for airlines and flight delays have costs for airlines, fuel, crew, right? So it's beyond the scope of the paper, very much so, to determine what the optimal value of rho is and how to determine rho with 10 airlines and 1 air traffic manager and maybe passenger association representatives, I don't know, much beyond the scope of this paper. But I think that painting the picture that, painting this table, or maybe a more interpretable version of this table, can build decision support to say, hey, how do we operate this? Are we willing to sacrifice 0.5%? Are we willing to sacrifice 3%? But look, all our passengers will be much happier. And today we have these types of discussions for different objectives. Like, do we want to be aggressive or not in our ground delay programs? And these types of decisions are made on a daily basis. And that would be one more.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And I also thought there was another interesting finding, and this is that you sort of said, okay, so we kind of, if we have 2 flights and then we have to decide upon which flight to choose, then we try to optimize the delays for those flights that have more transfer passengers in order to reduce connection problems, right?
Yeah.
But is this something that we could maybe solve heuristically? So maybe you can just have some rule of thumb that can help reduce calculation times and then maybe optimize in other dimensions. Because if you're using this more sophisticated approach to come up with a nice heuristic, and then this can be helped in order to, you know, expand into other directions, I think that's something that
I agree. So first of all, what I'm trying to do when I'm showing this type of things, and for the students out there, this is, I think, something that is not done enough in a person's research. So if you're working on that, I mean, that's something that I care very much about, is that oftentimes we stop at like showing the cost, right? Oh, I'm reducing costs, so it's good. The question is like how, and how to make the results interpretable for a decision maker. And here, the type of things that you picked up at him is exactly what that is like. Okay, so basically we reach that goal by doing that. So that was the primary motivation, meaning that even if what Nicole mentioned, like this implementation of this startup is not there yet, at least we have some rule of thumb that can guide decisions, right? So even if we don't have a software, at least we have some insights. And then, yeah, that's a good point. We can actually use that to speed up these computations, or to simplify that part of the model and add another layer elsewhere. Yeah, absolutely.
And then my last question is, what you did is, okay, so you don't know the passenger, you know, the passenger flow.
Yeah.
And then you have this regression approach. And then you say, okay, so you're using the information from the previous day in order to predict what's happening today, right?
Yeah.
So is this also the approach that you would recommend, or you think that could be implemented by air traffic flow management people?
Yes, with one caveat. Yes, so basically what I would do in practice, from a super practical standpoint, is I have all the information I want about flights, right? I know the flight network. This is public information. Then I would use Barnhart, Fearing, and Weiss to reconstruct passenger itineraries, to rebuild the new and latest database. It's basically a discrete choice model that uses aggregate passenger flows and distribute them at the itinerary level. And then from that database, I would use the latest information I have. Can be yesterday, can be last week, it doesn't matter too much. These are very stable results, by the way. I mean, if I do yesterday, if I do last week, if I do last month, I'm basically getting the same thing. To do this, and then I would optimize. So short answer is yes. Slightly longer answer is there's one additional step, meaning that we need to reconstruct data using 2012, I think, paper.
I see. Yeah, good. Yeah. So I wasn't sure whether this is really something that you just, you know, consider to be relevant for your study, sort of in order to test and analyze how these prediction systems could work, or whether you think this is really something that could be is implementable, so to say. And I understand your question and your answer in a way that indicates that yes, you think this is something.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Which is good if you want to, you know, make it a business idea, because then the practicality is very
and which is also good if you want, I think, to highlight opportunities for improvement and actually potentially impact practice down the line.
Yeah, great. I think that is definitely, you can see that it inspires a lot of questions and discussion. Wonderful. Are there some other questions from the floor? Otherwise, what I would be doing right now, I would be, first of all, I want to thank Alexandre for giving this wonderful presentation. Definitely good stuff. Very demanding, very sophisticated, very relevant. Yeah, so it was great. And thanks for giving the presentation. I also want to thank the the audience for the great questions. And this is the end of the workshop for today. And we see us tomorrow again. And the time is the same time, basically 9 a.m. Central European Summer Time. And so I think what I'm going to do right now, I will be a big applause, of course, from everyone, although you can't hear it. A big applause for the speaker, and I will stop the recording right now, and I will leave the room open because